Today, we're going to talk about Afrofuturism, which I believe is one of the things that will hopefully create some opportunities for us to get a little bit more inclusion and equity in the entertainment space. I'm joined by three amazing creators who also happen to be experts in the medium. And I'm going to start with Ytasha. Can you just say a couple of things about some of the work that you've done in the space and how you would define Afrofuturism?
Certainly. I wrote a book on Afrofuturism, and in addition to that, while I do work in theory, I also write fiction as well and utilize Afrofuturism as a basis for dance therapy, and I do film. So when I talk to people about Afrofuturism, I like to say that it's a way of looking at the future or alternate realities, but through a Black cultural lens. And you see it as an artistic aesthetic and that it's in music and dance, etc. But it's also a methodology for healing, and it's an epistemology, and that it is a way of looking at the world. So it intersects Black culture meaning all Black cultures around the world, liberation, technology, mysticism, and it differs from some other takes on the future from other cultural vantage points in that it values the divine feminine, which means that it values logic in the same way that it values intuition. It celebrates mysticism. It looks at time as being nonlinear, so the future, past, and present can very much be one. And it is a recognition that race is very much a technology, and that it's created and was justified, was created and really sort of encoded through law and violence. And so we've chipped away at that, but I think using that term technology is just sort of a reminder of how some of these dynamics are design layouts that we're often sort of working through. So with that, I really like talking about Afrofuturism because I like looking at resilience and the celebration and the use of the imagination to really transcend your circumstances. And I think during this period, I've done a lot of focus with these weekly Utopia chats on IG, just really looking at resilience in the culture and how that plays out into moments like this, what you look to, what you're pulling from, it being the ancestors, getting wisdom from the future, and just sort of seeing yourself as a point of intersection for these different, a point of intersection for transformation in the present.
Love it. Now I'm going to introduce Tananarive Due, who's actually a UCLA professor in addition to being a creator. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Can you talk a little bit about the impact on the culture? When we talk about Afrofuturism, I'm kind of, somebody who's gotten my toes wet because I just happen to be very nerdy and love sci-fi, love comic book culture, superhero culture, all that stuff. And so I have a few points of reference. But I'm curious, when you talk about the movement and the work, and I mean, really what's a growing body of work for the genre, who's the audience? How do what's the culture there? What are we tapping into? What creates the engagement?
Well, the audience is worldwide, and I really want to jump on this point of imagination in the African diaspora, because that to me is what Afrofuturism is, because it does also encompass fantasy, alternate history. Sometimes it's technological, sometimes it's futuristic, but it's always Black-centered, and it's revolutionary. So centering Blackness is in imagination is very much revolutionary today, and I think it's very important. And for that reason, it has a very wide appeal. I mean, there are Afrofuturism conferences in Germany. African futurism is beginning to take off as a concept among African writers, led by Nnedi Okorafor, who is an award-winning Nigerian-American writer who distinguishes between, the way I teach Afrofuturism is the Black speculative arts. And what I mean by that is the literature, music, comics, films of the imagination, like the not real world. So that means fantasy, imaginary places. That can mean in the future, a place we haven't been to yet, or like Julie Dash's film, Daughters of the Dust, the past. But interacting with the technologies of the past and trying to bridge, even in that film, which is set at basically the turn of the century, like trying to bridge between their past and the future we knew coming beyond the realm of the film. So I think this question of imagination is very appealing because often these African American or just Black, I prefer that word, Black artists are centering themselves and their concerns in stories that have to do about a wide range of topics. Like my screensaver virtual background is from the film Pumzi by a Kenyan director, writer named Wanuri Kahiu, rather. And it is about conservation, right? So her preoccupation in this film, there's some references to race, but it's not about race. And I think that that's one of the things that's so appealing about Afrofuturism. I mean, a story, let's say like Space Traders by Derek Bell, which Reginald Hudlin produced as a short for HBO, talks about what would happen if aliens came to the United States and offered technology and riches if they would just send their Black people away with the aliens, and what kind of trade-off that would be and what would happen. And we can guess what would happen, but it's not only that that would happen to a Black population, that would also happen to a Muslim population, to a Latinx population, an LGBT population. So in telling stories of the marginalized through sort of the funhouse mirror of speculation, of fantasy, science fiction, horror, like Get Out, it helps amplify issues that are in our faces every day, concerns that are in our faces every day, but from a fresh angle that enables engagement on a deeper level that for some people who may be more invested in the system as it stands, it makes it feel less personal. And you can sort of back away and look at it more objectively through the lens of fiction or through music or through art than you can say with your coworkers day to day who are complaining that they're not getting ahead because you might be steady in their way, you know what I mean? So,
right.
So it's just, I think for that reason, it's a very electrifying movement. And I just want to say one last thing, not to be a time hog here, but probably the best known Afrofuturist in the world right now is Octavia Butler. Right. And her work has been hailed as being so prescient. It's almost like she knew what was coming when she wrote Parable of the Sower. And my definition of a radical is someone who's paying attention. And Octavia was very much paying attention. She was someone who was watching the news. She was paying attention to climate change. She was paying attention to hierarchy. So all of these themes emerge in her work in a way that make her seem like a prophetess. You know, it's like, wow, how did she know? It's like, because she had her eyes open. That's how she knew. But she could tell stories that could engage us more deeply and inspire our imaginations.
Thank you so much for that. Kamil, so one of the things that we haven't really touched on right now in any kind of detail, and thank you for joining us, by the way, Tananarive just kind of teased it when she talked about some of these different media where we find Afrofuturism, right? It's not just, books. It includes film, television shows, shorts, music video, stage performances, right? George Clinton's Mothership. Well, maybe Bill gets on stage with him too. And so on and so on and so on, right? But one of my questions is this journey from taking source material. We just talked about Octavia Butler, and I know a lot of you have done different, work in this space, taking that source material and turning it into something that ends up in another medium, right? How do these things turn into TV shows and movies? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I work for Monkey Paw Productions, which is Jordan Peele's production company. It's really interesting to think about, how long the process can be, right, to adapt a piece of source material or IP, intellectual property, right, into a film or a TV show. And I think that, on top of having a really stellar story, one that hopefully does speak to, the condition of Blackness while also elevating it through genre, through, you know, Black imagination, which both of our panelists just talked about, you know, there also has to be the ability for it to be digested and translated to the folks who are the gatekeepers of Hollywood. And I think that's a conversation that I, you know, really hope is brought more into the classroom, especially with Black and POC creatives, because it's one thing for us to make stories about abolition or stories that use vampires to talk about capitalism, or, you know, whatever way we choose to use genre to talk about, you know, marginalized realities. But also too, you know, it does require a team of folks who can also get it sold. And whether that, you know, is an agent or a production company that understands vision and can kind of help craft a pitch, a deck, other materials that allow us to really understand the world, the characters, the motivations of the story, and, you know, its relevance thematically now, right? So that process, you know, looks a variety of ways, and I know that Chana, you can also speak to that as well, because she has a lot of experience with that. But I do think that you know, us understanding how to market Afrofuturism and Black speculative work without diluting it is something that will be an ongoing conversation, right? Because we're getting folks who have benefited from distancing themselves from Black realities and POC realities, right? Like, you know, we are having to get them to understand you know, the themes, the importance, and why it is necessary and critical for Black folks to see themselves outside of bondage and chains and outside of the traumatic stories that they have us, you know, encased in right now, especially in media, and over the past, you know, for the past couple generations. So anyway, that's just a little, you know, speaking towards that. So I think as an exec and as someone who works at a production company, my job has been helping to elevate stories that come in that may not speak to representation in a way that's most productive, right? And seeing how, if that story can be elevated, and also to kind of working to translate, right? So when we do get incredible creatives who are telling stories that need to be heard now, really just going to bat, right, for their work, and knowing how to, you know, but like Tananarive just said, explain why it is so important and beneficial for folks who may not see themselves as the target audience for Black stories, right? To realize that our stories matter and need to be amplified to a larger scale, right? So all those conversations happen through the process of development, but it definitely is a team effort. So it's not just, you know, incredible story. You gotta have a really good team that, you know, knows what the intention is and is really motivated to push it forward.
So I'm hearing from all three of you these incredible insights into, you know, these big themes, you know, resilience and reimagining our reality, talking about history and our future, centering Blackness, etc. And it's got me wondering, how did you guys first encounter Afrofuturism, right? What got you excited about the space?
Oh, well, I'll go. The first time I remember having a real conversation about what I now call Afrofuturism, I was a student at Clark Atlanta University. It was a few weeks into my freshman year. And I was talking to a guy from Philadelphia, actually, ironically, which is a big center for a lot of Afrofuturist thought. And we were just kind of having this conversation about, we're talking about Parliament Funkadelic, and then we start talking about quantum physics, and then we start talking about hip hop and its role in change and transforming individuals. And then we start talking about ancient African technologies, wanting to uncover more about some of the spiritual systems or knowledge systems, wisdom systems from Africa, and then trying to look at how you could apply things today. And so it was this really circuitous conversation. And at some point, you know, I was following the conversation. I asked the guy, I said, "What do you call this?" And he said, "I don't know." And I think sort of subconsciously, you know, it sort of was a period of awakening for me, where I just became more conscious of those ideas. Now, I grew up in Chicago. I'm in Chicago now. And I was part of a lot of communities where the imagination was very centered as a tool of awareness. I like to say that I was a part of a lot of organizations that people created as a utopia for me as a young Black woman to come through. So having a sense of self as a Black woman, having confidence as a Black person wasn't really an issue for me. And some of that could have been in part because I was in a very urban-centric space, and I was in these institutions that were either majority Black or heavily diverse. So I was empowered with a lot of information about the African American culture in particular, but I didn't see I always felt as if that particular narrative or a lot of the story was only told in one way. And there are all these gaps in information, gaps in the fantasy I was looking at. And I became really interested in wanting to, just sort of uncover and connect with more people and more artists who were in this walk of life. But I wasn't utilizing the term Afrofuturism. So in retrospect, I do remember reading the essay when, I was in college, the Mark Derry's Black to the Future essay, but the term didn't stick for me. It was really, some years ago when I encountered a woman who told me she was teaching Afrofuturism. And when she explained it, it then took me into, okay, wait a minute, these are the ideas I've been talking about forever. Friends of mine have really been into. And I wrote the book in part because I knew so many people who thought this way, but they felt alone and isolated. And they, the people who were into comics didn't know about the music. The ones who were into music didn't know all the history. The ones who were into the history didn't know the futurist thought. The ones who were into the spiritual piece didn't know about the comics. And it was like all these pockets of disconnect. And I said, you know what, let me just sort of write this project so people can see themselves, people of African descent on the continent, other people who aren't of African descent who just kind of connect with these ideas can say, oh, this is what I've been thinking. And then they can take it and sort of build from it. That was sort of the hope, because the idea of people feeling alone when they're part of a lineage of people on all sides of time who've been working with these ideas was just disconcerting to me. And anyway, so that's kind of how I interacted with my first encounter was in college. I had a lot of experiences in Afrofuturism through the arts, through dance, through music, and a lot of contemplation, a lot of dialogue with students. So for me, Afrofuturism it was very much a lifestyle and a way of thinking as much as it was a creative space. But it was a space of resilience in that, this whole idea of thinking about the future and really shifting and focusing on that for many people was a lifeline. It saved lives and inspired people. And it was also a way of sort of getting past traumas to feel comfortable to think about that future, or think about your future and forming, say, your present and past. And so those are some of the things that excited me about it.
I love that. I love that. I'm a little jealous of that story too, because it involves community. And I was really feeling more of that isolation you're talking about, right? Sometimes my students will ask me, well, did George Clinton ever talk to Octavia, ever talk to, Outkast, and all these artists who seem to be in literal conversation with each other. Unfortunately, sadly, we're never really actually in conversation with each other. A lot of people were out in these sort of outposts in their own fields, creating wildly imaginative and future-oriented art, but without a sense of connection for a lot of people. There was a listserv. Alondra Nelson, I think, started one back in the day. I wasn't a part of that. So I would say it was Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. I have to just say, watching Nichelle Nichols on the deck of the Starship Enterprise gave me the audacity to believe that A, we would be surviving into the future, and that B, I might be a communications officer on a starship, you know what I mean? Just to open up that imagination. But there are so many, and I'll come at it mostly as a creator, because that's where I started. There were a lot of barriers to my awakening as someone who might create Afrofuturism. Most of what I write is horror, but under my definition, and that's the kind of fantasy, so I also include horror. I found myself being steered away, not just from writing genre, period, as I went through college, but from writing Blackness, from writing Black characters. By the time I started writing Black characters as a child, but by the time I was an undergraduate at Northwestern University, exposed to canon, I was writing white characters. years. So think about that, how deep that is, that I was being written out of my own imagination. And I'll go back to the 60s and this idea of Nichelle Nichols. My parents were civil rights activists. My late mother, Patricia Stevens Due, my father, John Due, who's still living. And they were exercising the kind of Afrofuturism that I call real world building, which is not the world building we think of in a movie or a film, where it's just establishing the rules of the world and the currency and the religions. It's taking our world and trying to make a better future, which is what so many people are on the streets and on social media trying to do right now. It's like having the imagination to even think there could be a better way, to even just announce this is the better way that I want, is a radical act of imagination. So although I didn't have the role models in the arts, I didn't even discover Octavia's work, unfortunately, until I was midway through my second novel. So I felt like I had zero role.
Wow.
Oh, I didn't know. Someone said, have you read, I was writing a book called My Soul to Keep, which is about an African immortal. And someone said to me, have you read Octavia Butler's novel about an African immortal? And I was like, oh no, like there can only be one. And I panicked, and then I realized they're completely different. So woo, what a relief. But also, what a relief to realize that there was a writer named Octavia Butler, and I would meet her in later years. But I had to sort of, just with a flashlight and my own just nerve to think that I could, start writing my first novel, which was about alternate realities and related to my parents' civil rights history. And I remember writing my sister, do you think there's an audience for this? I really didn't know. So it has been beyond gratifying to go from not seeing the voices to there being so many Afrofuturists today that you could not fit them all on one stage. We couldn't invite everyone to this panel by any means.
Love it. Kamil?
Excuse me, there's some clanging. I'm outside in my neighborhood. But it's really interesting because, my experience and my introduction to Afrofuturism kind of falls in between the narrative and the spiritual, personal space. So I think that I too was a huge horror lover, aficionado. My sister, who was 11 years older than me, used to sneak me into the rated R horror films as a kid, and that includes, sci-fi and as well. But horror was really our point of connection, and I think, having a deep desire to see myself reflected in the stories that I love so much, I think really started my interest in just looking for Black genre artists, which I would later learn were Black speculative creators, right? But I do think that my relationship to Afrofuturism has a direct connection to Sankofa, the idea of, the ancestry in the past, building the future. And I think, similar to, the first story that was mentioned, my relationship to metaphysics and esoteric study happened at a very young age. So I'm 24 years old now, but I think maybe around the age of like 14 or so is when I really was, became interested in metaphysics and started going to a church called Agape in Los Angeles. That was a trans-denominational church and filled with a lot of Black folks. So we were dealing with, law of attraction, energy, metaphysics, and there was a movement kind of happening at the church because you had a lot of like white liberal folks who were really interested in the traditions and calling them New Thought. And that was one end. And then you had a lot of Black folks, a lot of elders, and just folks who were of different cultures who were there practicing because they knew that this tradition connected to ancestral faiths that they had always had connections to, and they called it ancestral wisdom. So I realized that all this new thought, all this idea of futurism, really did have a large rooting in ancestry. And my relationship to my spirituality, which is Ifa and Orisha based tradition, where we praise Black gods that have superpowers, right? That have the ability to that live in natural elements and manifest through universal energies and things like that. And so these are concepts that you may see in films like Black Panther, right? Where I love the scene where you realize that the ship is being powered by this energy that is conducted through meditation, right? So just certain so just my relationship to spiritual energy as and Black thought as something that has always been based on a deep understanding of divinity and ancestry and elements really led me to realize that Afrofuturism belonged to me. And the idea of seeing Black superheroes or seeing Black folks outside of bondage was something that a lot of folks really desired but were already existing in. And I think too, as a queer person, you know, I think a lot of our understanding of fluidity when it comes down to just gender, sexual, you know, orientation, presentation, all of that is related to Indigenous thought as well. So I think that for me, those are my relationship to my love for genre, for fantasy, also, you know, felt very personal to my ancestry and to my culture. And so I felt like Black folks in many ways were already living in the future. We're really yearning to see parts of their past into a future where they could exist freely. And that to me is really what the heart of Afrofuturism is. So I saw that in elements of spirituality, sexuality, gender, presentation as an alternative person, right? And lastly, I love anime. And in anime, I feel like there's such a range. It's just imaginative range, right? When it comes down to not only the mechanics of sci-fi, but also just the way that ancestry intersects with the future. And so I would watch shows like, you know, Ytasha and really just wish like, wow, what would it be like to have a Black girl who, like Kagome, who can hop in between an ancestral African, you know, village where she's from and modern day Los Angeles or Compton, or wherever she lives, right? Which is the premise of Ytasha. So things like that just made me go, there are folks who are producing these stories, right? And who are, you know, who are able to embody the ancestry and ideas of putting that in the future together. And so when I went at UCLA, I took a class with Tananarive Due on Afrofuturism, which really equipped me with just some of the literature that I had always been held from. I also was exposed to the canon, Kafka, you know, Portrait of Dorian Gray, all of those things. But coming to a class where I could, you know, realize that there was a whole Black speculative movement that was echoing Sankofa, and echoing Orisha, and echoing all the parts of my identity that I had been kept from, I realized, oh wow, Afrofuturism is a epistemology and a lifestyle, like, you know, we've already said. So that was my introduction.
I love that. It's crazy because the three of you talking is like my brain is exploding here. First, the issue around what Ytasha said about how we didn't have a name for it before. And you start thinking about these kind of cultural breadcrumbs that got dropped, whether it was George Clinton or X-Clan or Queen Latifah, right? You know, on the music side, characters that were not created by Black people. So Blade or Luke Cage, you know, et cetera, you know, characters who made their distinctive mark, you know, Cyborg and so on, and the major publishers that were not necessarily created by Black folks that were, you know, reclaimed by Black artists, like Black Panther with Christopher Priest, right? You know, and then this kind of what happened when mainstream science fiction engaged Black talent. So, you know, we don't really think of Star Wars as, you know, Afrofuturism traditionally, but I know that as a kid watching Billy D. Williams play Lando Calrissian, that hit me a certain way, right? Or Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek, or Geordie LaForge on Star Trek later, right? And certainly, you know, and I was in my feelings when Billy D. Williams did not make it to the first two sequels, right? I was like, well, where's General Calrissian, right? But this idea that we have this long arc of people having this conversation, this dialectic, from comedians to folks in, heck, some folks in sports, in addition to movies, film, TV, you know, and so on. We've seen it even in video games. And to come to this point where people finally have a name for it, and I think where people are more familiar with it thanks to the Black Panther movie. You have some sitting here in Wakanda. But certainly, we seem to be at an inflection point where the relationship between what we now understand to be Afrofuturism and the culture is evolving, right? And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about that piece, you know, kind of the ways in which Afrofuturistic content reflects our culture, and the ways in which it can impact it.
Sure. Well, one, I'll start off by saying, you know, that I actually grew up in New Thought. So I think it's funny that that there's a sort of a thread here in a lot of the things that we're saying, because that philosophy does heavily emphasize visioning and the imagination, and is there are a lot of Black centers of that particular philosophy, among others, that kind of give root or create sort of a Western point of engagement for a lot of the philosophies. As far as just the impact on the culture, I think that, one of the magical things about, say, the film Black Panther was that all of these ideas that had been spoken of, either, I don't want to say they were spoken of in secret, but certainly it wasn't something that you saw in the mainstream in a very broad way. But the film Black Panther showed that these ideas in Afrofuturism were, one, exciting, engaging, they were new and profitable, right? So those ideas were showcased in what we would call a validated space. So I think for many people who were kind of on the edges, not quite sure how they felt about it, whether they should be really embrace these ideas, whether they could speak of them, now they had a newfound confidence because you have this film that was a global phenomenon that they could point to and reference. And that created sort of a point for other people to be able to say, oh, Afrofuturism, oh, Black Panther. And not that Black Panther is the only, symbol of Afrofuturism out there, but I do think that it played a role in being able to have this larger conversation for at least creatives to be able to have conversations with people. I mean, it was only just, a couple of years ago when I was researching Afrofuturism and I would talk to people, I would ask about Sun Ra. And, I could say, who's Sun Ra? No one would know who I was talking about. Now, if I say, hey, have you heard of Sun Ra? Half the room will raise their hand. I mean, shortly after my book came out, I met a singer who was in Sun Ra's band. And someone showed him my book. And he said, oh, wow, Sun Ra would have really liked this. And I was like, no, he's in the book. Like, he's a big part of this entire movement. There's a whole chapter on him. And so there's these individuals who were working so hard and didn't always realize the impact that their work was having in this broader way, where it could be circled back and sort of reflected to them. So I think for some people, it's a reminder of, wait, I was on the right track. I'm supposed to be thinking about these things. It's okay for me to build on it. There are others who want to connect with me. So, not that I'm always into, this idea of seeking acceptance, but I do think that this sort of mainstream recognition of Afrofuturism has created more wind beneath the wings of a lot of creatives who feel that they can move in these directions. It's certainly given a lot of wings too to academics who were writing about this. And now, they can aggressively and assertively reference one another. Instead of having to keep, going back to the canon of European philosophers to try to dissect Black thought internationally. And so I think all of these things are helpful. And, it just gives people more confidence in the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I want to jump right in. I'm so excited by what everyone is saying. The difference is pretty dramatic in a pretty short amount of time. I've been teaching at UCLA, I think, only about 4 years, and I started teaching Afrofuturism. But back when I started, the showcase pieces of Afrofuturism, unless I wanted to go back to The Brother from Another Planet, and there was always Daughters of the Dust, but it was short films by virtually unknown filmmakers, like Pumzi, as a matter of fact. Although Wanuri Kahiu is getting more recognition now. She's working on the Wild Seed series with Nedia Korfor, I think for Amazon. But no, I mean, there wasn't that much in the short film space or in the film space. So Black Panther, and I call it the 1-2 punch of Black Panther and Get Out, was a real wake-up call for Hollywood, the way I think back in the 90s, Terry McMillan was in literature in terms of Black readers. Literally, Black publishing was like, oh, Black people read? And then, I came of age during that era. You could get a paperback tour, a hardcover tour, best hotels, and then and the same thing was happening in film. We had Eve's Bayou. So for a while, we had Tales from the Hood by Rusty Cundiff. Mm-hmm. So for a while, it looked like it was going to take off, but then it receded. And I think the difference now is that it would be a lot more difficult for it to recede. I don't think it's going to recede in the same way where we all but vanished from a lot of these spaces, because there are so many platforms, there are streamers, you can put it up on YouTube yourself. You know, I have a program to make animations. I don't know anything about making animations. I'm making animations now because I have a program that's teaching me how to do it. So it'll be hard to silence all those voices when it's never been easier or less expensive to produce your own work. But having said that, there are still some pitfalls. Obviously, less expensive still doesn't mean cheap. It's very, very expensive to produce film and television. It's still a challenge to find platforms. There's still a disconnect between the gatekeepers and the creatives, to the point where, you know, a major horror house can say that there are no Black horror writers out there, when I'm like, well, hold on, I'm a Black horror writer, and I know all my friends are Black horror writers, so I don't really, there's this disconnect. And while that's changing, you know, I've literally had studios reach out to ask me to consult on projects. And one of them was, I hope, is about to pay me. We'll see what happens. It was on the calendar before the pandemic. We'll see if that still happens. But there are more people who are aware that problems exist. But I think we need to be vigilant as creators, because Hollywood's first impulse is going to be to address it only through casting. To take a script and then add a Black actress, right? And then make that, now it's Afrofuturism, whether or not the script is addressing anything to do with race. Not that every story that stars and centers Black people can or should be about race. It's also revolutionary just to exist. I totally get that. There's some work that was so-called blind cast, where they changed the actors to Black, where it worked just fine. And there are some cases where it's a disaster, because by not addressing race, you're opening up visual systems that no longer make any sense, and they're not being addressed. So it becomes a triggering thing rather than a healing thing. So I think we really have to work on that disconnect between the gatekeepers and the creatives. We have to be able to push not just Black faces, but Black stories, right? Which is the difference between, I haven't seen the new Candyman, Kamil, but I'm just going to imagine that is Candyman through a Black lens, whereas the original Candyman was not through a Black lens. It had a lot of Black faces, but it was not a Black-oriented story. And because of that, some very harmful tropes emerge in genre: sacrificial Negro, magical Negro, first to die, where we appear in the story, but we're not quite fully human. We're not quite three-dimensional. We don't have our own lives and wants and needs. We're only there in service to the white characters. And there's still going to be some residual aspects of that in the industry, because people like to make movies with people they have experience with. They know the relationship is good. You're not going to flake out at the last minute. It's very difficult for newcomers to get a foot into Hollywood, especially if it's a story that is in any way, shape, or form dealing with racial tensions, you know? So The Watchmen, it's great that that room could get that story told, but that's not the first time anyone's tried to tell the story of the Tulsa massacre on film or TV. Trust me, I don't know all the people, but I know there are a lot of people who have wanted to have that story told, and it's all about access. So we need more people like Kamil coming up through the system. I know as a creator, if I go into a pitch meeting and there's a Black woman sitting across from me at the table, or a woman of color especially, I have a better chance of moving forward with this meeting than if not, or if the boss who gives the green light has an inherent interest in Black stories, not just because it's profitable, but because they really care about exposing that history, or trying to, like with Get Out, for example, which I know wasn't a walk in the park for Jordan Peele to get made, because a bunch of people didn't get that and didn't want to get that. But that is a story that is very much from a Black experience, you know, to help you see the world through our eyes. And those kinds of stories are very valuable. And we still have our work cut out for us, breaking in. Someone is asking, is how big a movement do I see in TV? I know Kamil can talk about this more than I can. I tell creators all the time, there has never been a better time to be a creator of the speculative arts, or probably any arts, but I'll just stick with the speculative. And right now is that time. So whatever you're doing, learn how to write scripts, finish that book, finish that comic book, get it out there. Now is the time. But at the same time, there's still a lot to be overcome.
Well, that's a great segue to Camille. I mean, you bring up Get Out, and one of the things that struck me about Get Out was not just the commercial success, but the impact on popular culture, right? All the memes and social media traffic generated from the themes in that movie will live on well beyond when people are familiar with the title, right? We'll be dealing with kids who were born 10 years from now who will not know that those tropes came from Get Out, right? And that's the, I think the heart of the question I was asking earlier around this relationship between Afrofuturism and culture itself, right? That we get to be seen. And I feel like, Camille, in the work that you do right now, this kind of relationship between trying to commercialize the work, but also to make sure that it's an authentic reflection of, what we want to elevate from our culture, that's really the opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. And like we said, I think social media, as Asani, spoke to, plays a really large role in Afrofuturism and the demand for it being more visible, alongside folks being able to, produce their own work independently. Black Twitter is a beast, right? If you release a film, a project, like you said, within a couple of seconds, a meme, a GIF, some form, it enters into the zeitgeist, and the zeitgeist eats it up, right? It does what it will do with it. And so I feel like that level of audience response, and especially, I think the level of audience response, one, is a one-to-one. So execs and other folks who were able to talk over audiences now no longer can, because audiences have their own platform to speak up about their opinions, and they have no ties to these celebrities, so they don't care. Right. And I think that's, very authentic. And then two, there is, because the information is so much more available, pitches from folks online and fan fictions and just, the Black imagination as far as, viral fame and just viral thought is concerned, I think has also just made it apparent, like, that, these ideas are not rare. They're just, intentionally not amplified, right, by the industry. And so I think too, Black folks are just so tired of plantation, police brutality, slaying narratives, right? And that is, I feel like if I had $1 for every time in the past 2 years, one of those stories have come across my desk from a Black creator or a creator of color or someone who is well-intentioned, it's just overwhelming, right? So I agree with Tananarive that right now, companies like Monkey Paw and, Macro, a lot of, Wonderland, Janelle Monáe's company, a lot of folks have a large interest in Afrofuturism, alongside larger studios, right? Because, we are the only people who can tell these stories. And now, of course, if you give a white cis hetero male creator a budget and an idea, he will come out with his own version of Black Panther. It will happen. And so I feel like, just like Tananarive said, we have to be in a space where we are just rigorous about our work, and just unrelenting about getting it funded, release. I've seen so many Black creators who use Kickstarter and broken records for, their idea, just the public and the culture desiring their ideas so much. And two, when I think about Afrofuturism, it just I think about it as, Black folks having the right and feeling empowered to envision a future for themselves. What does that look like, right? And right now, and as we've seen, Hollywood is just cycling this, this segment of Black torture and suffering that they want us to, I believe they want us to remain in, right? And so I think that, the audience and everyone is asking for our media to reflect the Black futures that we know that our social movements and a variety of our other initiatives are working towards. So I do feel like, like Anthony Davis said, no political movement can be complete, without an artistic movement that is working with it. They work together. And so I feel like Afrofuturism is also being pushed forward because movements for Black life, and movements against state violence are also continuously, pushing forward again. And I think social media and visibility is helping. So they're just all one big, intersection. But once again, Black folks want to see a future that they can determine, because we know that we can do that. That is our power. And so our media has to reflect that. And people are just not, there are no longer the same social benefits and social capital with silence as well. And social media makes it so easy. So folks are making their opinion known. And so these stories have to get made. So yeah, folks are really yearning, production companies are really yearning for what the next Get Out, what the next framework will be to discuss injustice or gender or Me Too, whatever the topic is, because we need it, right? And the community is asking for it.
Absolutely. And I would say this is a great point to deal with the next in two ways. First, I want to tell the folks who are participating that you guys can ask questions too. If you scroll your mouse down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a chat button. Click on that button and feel free to type questions. I will share them with our presenters as we go. So feel free to do that. We actually just answered one a little while ago. So jump into that. And then with that, I want to ask my esteemed panelists to talk about projects coming up that you're excited about, you know, stuff that you're working on or stuff that you've heard of that you're excited about that's, you know, kind of in the pipeline and on its way.
Sure. I'm working on I have a graphic novel I'm working on called Black Cube. As a matter of fact, I'll be finished with it the next couple days, and I'll be sending out. And it's coming through Megascope,
Nice.
which I'm happy about. I have a series that I'm developing called Bar Star City. So I'm just sort of working on that. It's in the development stage and is in the Afrofuturist world. And as far as projects that I'm really sort of looking for, or I'm kind of excited about, I'm a big music person. So I'm really curious to see like how music will evolve with some of the current protests and things that are taking place. You know, I'm really interested in like the new sounds that are gonna sort of move forward. I was a big Raj G fan, and I really like the LA beat scene and house music. And so both digitally and then sort of lyrically, I'm just curious to see how will people feel comfortable addressing some of the issues or just sort of speaking to the times.
I'll jump in next. I've been publishing since 1995, and I've always had sort of sporadic film and TV interests in my work, but I would say right now is the most consistent time. I haven't signed it yet, so I can't talk about one that's just about to pop, one that's very close to popping for two different works. I have a novel. I have a novel called The Reformatory that hasn't even been published yet, but I'm already getting some in that. And there's a work that Kamil is familiar with because she's seen a look at it that will be also a Megascope graphic novel called The Keeper that we're paired with an artist and already working on that. So I'm very excited to enter the graphic novel space. This is something that my dear late friend, Leslie Banks, LA Banks, who was a horror writer back in the day, always wanted me to do. So that is a good, I think, midway point between a story and a film is to have it storyboarded and illustrated as a graphic novel. So yeah, I'm very excited about where we are right now.
And so curious, you know, obviously when we talk about graphic novels, comic books, stuff like that, you know, there are so many different jobs, right? There's the plotting, the scripting, pencils, inking, finishing, coloring, etc. When you started to move in that direction to work on a graphic novel, were you thinking that you wanted to kind of handpick an artist to work with you? Did you have a vision for what you know?
Not at all. It was an accident.
Really?
Well, I sent the editor, John Jennings, a treatment and sent him the script just for feedback.
Right.
He was like, oh, this has to be a graphic novel. So I mean, literally, it was not
Nice.
intention at all. It wasn't in our minds in the slightest. I'm always writing spec scripts. So that was just another spec script that an editor got excited about.
So that's a whole separate conversation that we're going to have with him on at another time,
Yes,
where we start talking about publishing too. I think, you know, we've talked really about music, TV, and film, but the printed page that still gives you those graphics that evoke some kind of response and images and so forth, like that's a whole nother thing. And you were talking before about the issue around price, you know, and the cost of producing work. Where what, you know, where when we talk about publishing, that price goes down tremendously, right? Because it's really the price of the talent. And nowadays with digital distribution, you can reach large audiences with your work without having to invest a whole bunch of money up front. And it's a great way to kind of try new ideas or to kind of reach a new audience with work that you've already done. So yeah, that's very exciting. We need to kind of get into that at some future point.
And one thing you're absolutely right about is that had I wanted to just do a graphic novel on my own, you know, said, okay, well, I'm not going to look for an editor. I'm just going to do this myself. I absolutely would have reached out and found an artist. And I could put that out myself. And that is a lot cheaper than even producing the cheapest web series. You know what I mean? So I think the graphic novel space is a really, really important and exciting area. It's no coincidence that Black Panther started as a comic, you know, and a lot of these big blockbusters start as comics.
You know, and Jay, I just have to say, I've done a lot of publishing in the indie space and in mainstream spaces.
Right.
And when you know, my Rayla 2212 series was self-published, and I got like a big following with that. I did a project called A Spaceship in Bronzeville, which was a Kickstarter project, which is a small book package that through a residency that I had last year, and that was indie. So, I mean, there's a real world around just creating your story, getting it out, having an audience. And if you want to sort of develop it into something else later, you can, but I think it's very rewarding to know you can write the story, you can get it out, you can do your own kind of marketing, build your audience, and I think it's a sense of achievement and accomplishment. And so you can still do things that are mainstream, but you can kind of go back and forth if you can, or if you're still in what you call breakthrough stage. It's okay to be able to create your own sort of audiences for your works. Because again, you know, to me, it's and I don't know how other creatives feel or how you might feel, Tananarive, but for me, it's like sometimes you just want to get it out, you know, because that's a stepping point to just having a larger story. Like you can't do the next story until you get this one out. And yeah, I just think that's a rewarding experience.
I imagine that part of this also is making sure that you have a following too. I mean, when we talk about the idea of getting people to greenlight your ideas, part of that has to do with, you know, well, what's the size of your following? How many folks have you reached? And if you can do graphic novels or other things that potentially connect with more people, but don't necessarily require as much of an investment in resources, is just another way to get people familiar with your storytelling and potentially engaged, so that when you go for the next project, you can say, I've got these people behind me who were really, you know, fans of the other work. And I think that, you know, we can only, you know, creators can only do so much with social media by itself, right? At some point, you got to create some stuff. So I can see how, in addition to writing novels, screenplays, and so on, graphic novels can play a role in trying to bump up that audience. And Kamil, I didn't forget about you. Any projects that you're excited about?
I'm really interested to see how all of the Octavia Butler projects are adapted. Because, you know, I think it's interesting, especially, you know, to have everyone talk about how, you know, the collective interest, or it feels like, you know, the public interest in Afrofuturism has been there, but the visibility and the access and the ability to tell those stories has not been there. So for you know, to go from zero to Octavia Butler, I'm like, wow, I have to see how this is done. And like, you know, Tananarive said, like, you know, it has to happen. You know, we have to have some folks who do it first, right? And we have to see how that goes. So I'm excited to see how, you know, Amazon and Macro, Ava DuVernay, and all the different folks who are working on Octavia Butler projects adapt them. I also have some folks who were working on a project for Monkey Paw who are also working on Octavia Butler project as well. So I've seen like maybe 3 in the works right now. So that's why my mind is just so in that space. Because not only is her horror work being adapted, or her one horror work, you know, or one hard horror work being adapted, but so is her sci-fi pieces. So there's a lot I feel like is going to come out in the next couple of years that's speaking to you know, just Octavia's world, and I'm interested to see how that is translated on screen, because it is very radical and fluid in a lot of different ways. And it does, and like Tanani said, it did predict a lot. So I'm just curious to see where that goes. And then also personally, I'm you know, just always excited to see and to work on projects with other writers. I'm outside of Monkey Paw. I write. I love to stay in the genre speculative space, horror, fantasy, sci-fi. So continuously practicing that craft, and then I'm really interested too in folks who are speaking to the ways in which you know, futurism and music are continuing to evolve, especially for Black folks. There was a documentary done, sorry, not documentary, there was a film done by Jen and Kiru called Black to Techno, which talked about techno's roots in Detroit and dealt with, you know, just the idea of, once again, Black folks reinventing sound and utilizing technology in new and interesting ways. So I know that that continuously happens. So I'm also interested to see how that continues to evolve as well.
Love it, love it. So it turns out that we've been talking about somebody, John Jennings. We just were talking about graphic novels and publishing and so on, and he's here. So John, let's see if we can unmute your video and unmute your audio and say hi.
Hello.
Great to have you.
Thank you so much. My calendar got really jacked up by another thing, so, and then baby. So I'm so sorry.
Glad you could give us a few minutes. I know that we're kind of over time already, but I do want to make sure that we kind of close the circle, so to speak. We've been talking about the many different aspects of Afrofuturism, and one of them that I think we're all really excited about is publishing, right? Graphic novels, comic books, and so on. Partly because, you know, it's still a visual medium, but, you know, it can much more easily get produced, much more easily reach lots of people, and so on. And you've been doing big things over these last couple of months. Could you just, first of all, just talk about what you've been up to, and then can you just tell our guests how you know Tananarive and Ytasha?
Oh, for sure. I'll start there, actually. I've been friends with both of them for a very long time, it seems now, as far as, like, you know, it seems like since Afrofuturism kind of got put back into, like, the modern day parlance over the last, like, decade or so. The three of us have been at various you know, spaces around Black speculative culture. And I actually designed the cover for Ytasha's book, and, you know, kind of consulted on a few things with her. And Tananarive and I have been, you know, have guest spoken in each other's classes, like, many times. And actually both of them are actually have graphic novel projects with my new imprint right now, which is very exciting as well. And actually that's actually how I met Kamil and Jordan and Monkey Paw folk too, was through Tananarive. And yeah, there's so many connections that it's really kind of amazing. So we've been, like, editing work together. Tananarive actually was a sensitivity editor for the Parable of the Sower graphic novel that we did. So she gave us she gave us a thumbs up to kind of go with that. And yeah, and Ytasha and I have been collaborating on many projects over the last few years. So as far as, like, the things that are jumping off immediately, of course, the first two major projects we worked on was the adaptation of Octavia Butler's Kindred into a graphic novel, myself and Damian Duffy, for Abrams Comic Arts. And the follow-up, which just came out in January, which is Parable of the Sower, we actually have a 2-book deal to do those 2 books as well. Damian has just finished the first draft of the new of Parable of Talents. And because of the success of those graphic novels, I was actually able to pitch a new line of books called Megascope, which comes from the W.B. Du Bois science fiction story. It's a device that can see through time and space. So I thought it would be a really cool name for a imprint, which is specifically going to be looking at comics by and about people of color, and also historical fiction. We're actually doing an Emmett Till graphic novel, among other things. And also crime fiction. I'm a big crime fiction nut, so that's actually gonna be a track as well. And the first couple of books are going to be coming out probably in next year, early next year. They should have been sooner, but the virus kind of had other plans for us. So, but that's kind of it in a nutshell. But as you know, as a theorist and a speaker and a creator, I've been really in the middle of a lot of these conversations around Afrofuturism and Black speculative culture for the last decade or so. And I do believe I met Tananarive and Stephen at the Astro Blackness conference that we did at Loyola Marymount. If that's not, I think we did 2 of those, maybe. Yeah, exactly. So, and I met Ytasha through, like, a mutual friend. So, you know, also incidentally, her, I didn't notice at the time, but, you know, her and my wife went to the same high school too. So there's a lot of connections throughout time and space.
Well, so, and that's the thing, I realize, and this is one of those things that often gets overlooked, the importance of real personal connections when we talk about anything creative. Yeah. And one of the challenges, I think, when we talk about the industry, you know, in LA, when we say the industry, we mean the entertainment industry. When you ask in New York City, if you work in the business, that probably means Wall Street, but here, that's what we're talking about. We talk about the industry and having success there. I think it's really important that we find ways to meet with each other and collaborate with each other. And it's funny because I see those same themes actually in the work.
Mm-hmm.
When you, whether it's music lyrics or graphic novels or movies or novels, right? You see these themes of interdependence, right? We try to have strong, resilient characters that kind of withstand certain challenges and so forth. But there's also this other thing that goes on where in many of these stories, we see characters learning who they can trust and how they can find a way to work with those people, whether it's just building a personal relationship or trying to overcome a challenge. And we have to be able to do that in real life too. You know, I'm wondering if there are forums. I mean, obviously we're all stuck at home right now, but are there forums in real life where folks can get to meet you, get to know you, figure out how to kind of collaborate, build with you, and so on, things that you would recommend that would, you know, get people plugged into the, you know, to Afrofuturism generally, but also to the Black creative arts overall?
Well, I'm just going to jump in and say Twitter. I'm at Tananarive Due. I'm not just trolling for followers, although feel free to follow. But
Please follow Tananarive.
I learned so much on Twitter. Twitter is not just, it's not primarily a place I go to teach. It's a place I go to learn, you know, and a lot of connections through Twitter. If you want to learn filmmaking, I learned crowdfunding by watching other people crowdfund on Twitter. There's a lot of great leadership, especially right now when so many people are looking to social media for answers because we've been engaged in this conversation for so long. And some people
Right.
are just learning that this conversation is happening. So that, and you know, for those who still Facebook, there is an Afrofuturism group on Facebook as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's so many different Black comic book spaces now too. Like there's like Black comics creators, there's independent comics creators. There's a closed space around, it's called Plan C Distribution, which is talking about like the fact that, you know, comics as an industry is like shifting right now because of the virus and because of DC breaking ties with the biggest distributor in the world, which just happened. So yeah, some very tumultuous things happening there.
With Diamond, right?
It is yeah, for sure, definitely. And I mean, you know, take advantage of a good crisis, I guess, is the mantra. But there used to be a space called the Museum of Black Superheroes back in the day that was a really great forum for like exchange of information between Black creators. And that's kind of like almost turned into like a, you know, a Black superhero diaspora, because now you have all the different comic book conventions that are, you know, created that are, you know, Afrocentric or Black and Latino, you know, or people of color in general. All that is out there. They even have an Indigenous Indigicon for, you know, Native American creators. So it's a really diverse field, and I think that it's wonderful that that connection between comics and Afrofuturism is becoming more explicit. So,
Kamil, is that part of your role actually to identify those opportunities to make those connections, to, you know, figure out if there's trade shows or conferences or other kind of things?
Yeah, so as an exec, I feel like, you know, I would actually say majority, if not a rough 50-50, 60-40 would be, you know, being in the office, working in development, listening to pitches, you know, working on projects that we're working on ourselves, working on releasing ourselves, and then also just being in the field in the sense of, you know, having a lot of meetings with folks, having generals, meeting with creatives one-on-one, just folks who, you know, whose POV you vibe with, but also too, you know, going to conventions and going to Comic-Cons in different spaces is really important, especially for me. I don't think most execs do it, but I think it's something that I do in my everyday life, because that is just a space where I go to find community. I go to, my favorite con I go to is BlurredCon, which Black NerdCon, which happens in DC. And there is a great intersection, a focus on consent, a focus on Black life, politics, on top of Afrofuturism and representation. So there's a huge community out there, and from that con I found DragonCon, Atlanta, and other spaces that I really adore. So anyway, I do think that that's something that I'm trying to make more normal, because I definitely think that when we think about niche culture and pushing a future that Black folks you know, can live, exist, and thrive in, I think that a lot of these smaller niche spaces where, you know, they're rigorously going over content and media and have a lot of otaku and fan culture, you know, that is latest representation or the lack thereof. So I feel like all the discourse that happens in that space really is pushing the future. So I appreciate being there. And I think that other execs should be in those places as well. I do worry though that I always say that, like, you know, those are sacred spaces for a lot of us. And so the first year I went to BlurredCon, for example, Monkey Paw did fund me to go. I brought back books and creators and folks who I talked to, and it really was like an assignment as far as how I had to report after. The second year and the years thereafter that I go on my own accord. And I just now know how to naturally, you know, yes, hand out my card, yes, just have an eye for new stories, new perspective, new video game designers and so forth. But also too, that's just a space that I love. So I don't want it to be infiltrated by too many gatekeeper industry folks who are just, you know, looking for the next great idea. So just kind of like keeping that in mind as well, is just intentionally. Well, yeah, it's a great place to be.
It's funny because Ytasha's in the backyard of, what is it, WakandaCon is up there in Chicago?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, there's WakandaCon. And I actually had a fun experience working with the ladies at WakandaCon. We did a night in the Afrofuture at the Adler Planetarium.
What?
And I had a chance to bring the Rayla universe to life, you know, through dance, art, and music in the Sky Showroom. Can you imagine? And then several days after that, that's when we moved into this period. So I kind of felt like it was the big celebration.
Right, just before we got locked down.
Right, before the lockdown. So, yeah. But as far as references, there's a IG talk that's pretty cool by, it's called Maison Le Fleur, and I'll make sure I post it. But each week she does What Does the Afrofuture Say? And interviews different Afrofuturists, which I think is just kind of cool, you know, to hear what people are saying about this current period. Her name is Ingrid LaFleur, and she's a curator. And then I do a Utopia talk each week on IG Live. I'm doing one today at 7 p.m. And if anyone wants to check it out, but I'll be talking to Edson Burden, who's an Afrofuturist in Bristol. And he's a historian and a writer. So I've been doing these each week again to kind of keep people resilient, and I pull from different themes in Afrofuturism. So if you guys want to check that out, there's, you know, some other interviews I've done in the past that are also on the site that look at how to plan around lunar cycles, talking about how to protect yourself during, you know, these times with the virus, looking at music, pentaconic scales, that kind of thing. So it's a cool range, and I usually have people vote on the topics each week.
That's amazing. And I would, you know, it's funny because we've been all over the place talking about different places and ways that people can get plugged in and have this experience. You've teased music a couple of times. If I were a total clueless noob when it comes to the ways in which these themes pop up in music, where would you direct me? What should I be checking out first?
Well, to go kind of deep on you, I'm going to suggest a couple artists. I like King Britt. He's a producer instrumentalist who actually is teaching a class at a university in California around sort of the history of electronic music and Black culture. So following his Twitter, I think will be cool. I would say I'm a big Ras G fan, so I'm always going to recommend him. I think that Angel, the Oracle, she's a kind of comes out of the Sun Ra tradition. She's out of Chicago. Nicole Mitchell, another person who comes out of the Sun Ra tradition. If you don't know who Sun Ra is, I think he's a good person to listen to. I would also suggest Alice Coltrane. I think it's really important. She pulls a lot from Eastern philosophy and sort of, I think that's really cool to look at how that evolves. And you know what? If you go on Spotify, there's actually a playlist that I co-curated with, right, with Janelle Monáe. So if you go on her Spotify, the whole list, it's like, you know, she, you know, myself and, you know, and her camp, we put together a big list of songs. And so you can check those out too.
It's funny that you bring that up because I know she's been heavily influenced. Like you look at her, all her imagery and the way she approaches her persona and everything, clearly influenced. I didn't realize it went that deep. So yes, I'll head over to Spotify too.
Yeah, and I have to say too that Janelle Monáe's team came out of the Atlanta University Center, just like I did. I went to Clark Atlanta. The University Center has Morehouse and Spelman, the school that used to be Morris Brown, all historically Black colleges in Atlanta. And I think it's just sort of significant that, you have some of these, there was so much Afrofuturist discussion there. Using the term, not using the term, and people got to live it and breathe it. And I think that scene played a big role in the culture.
Yeah, I love this.
Did you mention Planet Deep South?
No, Planet Deep South's amazing. Yes, Planet Deep South as a conference is super amazing. There was one at Jackson State where John Jennings went, and then the second one was at Clark Atlanta University. And I think it's important, I'm a person, again, I'm from Chicago, but I'm a descendant of the Great Migration, as many of us are. And, but, we don't always centralize the South. And I have to really kind of give a big, wave to John for doing a lot of work to help centralize the South, the contemporary South, also in our understandings of Afrofuturism. I see someone posted Flying Lotus. Yes, thank you very much.
Flying Lotus for sure. Of course, like what Deltron 3030, right? People like that. I was just thinking too, as far as like the Planet Deep South joint, a lot of it came from us thinking about the fact that a lot of these people who are like progenitors of what is called like Black speculative culture, one thing about the Black speculative arts movement, what have you, are coming out of the South, particularly when you start thinking about folk like Fannie Lou Hamer or like, even Sun Ra, Sun Ra's from the South, originally. George Clinton's from the South originally. I mean, he becomes the George Clinton in the Midwest, but a lot of these notions of like aspiration and about going forward to a better life or fighting for a better life are coming from these Southern spaces. John A. Williams was from the South, even Janelle Monáe, like you said, has now become like, she's become more of a Southern, relationship, as far as an outcast, of course, stuff like that. Even the fact that Wakanda for in a certain sense was, it was made in a lot was made in Atlanta, that kind of thing. I think for me, it's like the South is always relegated to like these haunted spaces or these spaces of trauma, these spaces of pain. And you don't really see a lot of science fiction that's created out of the South, very little. And I think that needs to change as far as like, future thinking, speculative narratives around people of color.
I want to name one other artist, George Earlin, a jazz instrumentalist. He has a song in an album called Leave This Planet. I Want to Leave This Planet. He also has just all of his albums are very much kind of universally themed, tied into the solar system. But that song, Leave This Planet, is a very eerie song. And, it's talking about wanting to leave this planet because he can't find justice on Earth. And I think that may be kind of an interesting song to hear now in the midst of things, and just think about its impact.
Love it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about 20 minutes over time, so I'm getting the hook from my producers. But I will say that this is probably one of the most fun conversations and informative conversations I've had in a long time. And I can't thank you enough for joining us. This has been kind of an all-star clinic on what's been going on with Black creativity. And I'd love to try to round us up again and try to do this again and dig down into some of the topics we've surfaced. But I hope those of you who've been participating online appreciated the experience. Ytasha, John, Kamil, Tananarive, thank you, thank you, thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was about to write in the comments because someone pointed out that Twilight Zone season 2 is about to drop, and my collaborator husband Stephen Barnes and I wrote an episode called A Small Town starring Damon Wayans. Yes. So I got to plug that, and that is
Please do.
On TV, and that just shows you how an artist like Jordan Peele can open doors for people who are way out of the Hollywood scene.
Definitely.
That's exciting. Congrats.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. And that's what I'm talking about, that we're gonna, you know, Kamil mentioned that these spaces like BlurredCon, that they're niche. Everything is niche until it's not,
That's
right?
right.
George Martin was niche until he wasn't.
That's correct.
And so, you know, all the work that you guys are doing, it's inspiring, it's amazing. The way that you all are collaborating and connecting the dots, that's what we need to do. And we keep building, we find our opportunities, and eventually you will see that the rest of the market will get hip to this. And that's when you guys yourselves will have created tons of opportunities for the people coming up behind you. So once again, thank you, and let's keep this conversation going. To be continued.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
be safe out there.
Be safe.